This podcast is made possible by our supporters on Patreon, who pledge an amount to contribute every month and in return get exclusive access to bonus content, merchandise discounts, and much more. If you'd like to join our family, please go to patreon.com/Gotham Variety and subscribe. That's Patreon/Gotham Variety.
And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of the Gotham Variety Podcast. I want to welcome all of our listeners. We thank you very much for your support and for joining us today, hoping you enjoy our conversation with W.K. Stratton, author of an amazing book about one of the very best Westerns of its era, of any era actually, The Wild Bunch, it's one of those films you can see it 10 times and still find something new. And we'll get into it with the foremost living authority on this film right after this.
You can follow us on Twitter @Gotham Variety, like us on Facebook, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. We're on Spotify as well. Check out our website at gothamvariety.com, where you can send us your comments and questions. And if you love what we're doing, we'd love a 5-star review on the podcast platform of your choice. Reviews and ratings help keep our show on the charts, so more and more people can find us.
We are joined this week on Gotham Variety by a very special guest, W.K. Stratton, who goes by Kip, author of The Wild Bunch, Sam Peckinpah, A Revolution in Hollywood, and the Making of a Legendary Film. The LA Times, in their starred review, said the book takes you deeper than deep into the on-set shenanigans and off-screen dramas of a film that married an old-fashioned belief in the importance of codes of honor with a modern willingness to explore ambivalent attitudes toward violence. Kip, it's great to have you with us today. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well. Now, you begin your book with a bit of autobiography, where you talk about your first viewing of The Wild Bunch as a teenager in 1969. I'm wondering if you could tell the listeners about that experience and explain what it was about this film that made it such a lifelong reference point and led you to write this book.
Well, I was born in the mid-1950s, so unbeknownst to me, I was taking in a lot of movies that were part of what's now called the second golden age of Hollywood. Those films made roughly between the release of Bonnie and Clyde in 1967 and the release of Star Wars in the 1977 timeframe. So there was about a 10-year period there where the business of Hollywood was such that there was a lot of money around for kind of art films. And so I was taking in a lot of this as a kid without knowing that I was watching art films. I know that some movies impressed me more than others and kept me interested in the movie and thinking about it afterwards. So I had gone to see things like Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate and other films that people talk about a lot. And then when I was 13 years old, I slipped into the Melba Theater in my hometown in Oklahoma and saw The Wild Bunch. And to say that I was shell-shocked would be understatement. I'd never seen anything quite like that on the screen, particularly in the realistic portrayal of violence. That spoke to me because I was coming into my adolescence during a very violent time in American history. Certainly, the Vietnam War was continuing to go on. We had a great deal of strife surrounding the civil rights movement, particularly the reactions to it by people on the far right wing and often reacting violently. And the great examples of that would be, of course, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, and then a few months later, Robert Kennedy in 1968. So I was attuned to this terrible situation in the world of violence. And then I saw The Wild Bunch, and it hit me that this is what violence is like. And then as the years went by and I saw it again and again, I realized there was much more to this movie than just the violence. That nowadays, as we see it, and we are so desensitized to portrayal of violence in movies that it doesn't seem quite that bad in terms of the bloodletting, although I think the psychological elements that of what it does to people when they're caught in violence, I think those are still disturbing in this picture and are indeed realistic. And I should say, I grew up in Oklahoma. My birth father was a rodeo cowboy. I was around that whole cowboy culture all my life. So definitely Westerns were part of my life. And this was the Western that kind of put the tombstone on Westerns. And, everything that came out of that really had to be a revisionist Western in some way, because what had gone on before in typical movie Westerns just no longer would float anymore.
Okay, so Sam Peckinpah, a fiery, combative man, was also a man of strong artistic convictions. He knew what he liked and he knew what he hated, and I was fascinated to learn from your book which Westerns had impacted him. He actually was not an uncritical admirer of John Ford, although he did hold My Darling Clementine in high esteem. That's a great film. But he placed Shane, 1953 classic, directed by George Stevens, above all other Westerns. So, Kip, what was it about Shane that Peckinpah responded to so strongly, and how did that film influence his later output, especially The Wild Bunch?
George Stevens, who I don't think many people talk much about these days, he had a certain serious approach to movies that he took after the war, and Shane was one of them. It was an art film. It is something that dealt with violence in ways that were atypical for American pictures. There's a fist fight, and there's one point where Shane pops Ben Johnson's character in the face, and Johnson falls down, and he gets up, and his nose is bloodied, and there's blood all over his face. That was not typical for Westerns. If you watched a lot of those from the 1950s and before, where people were throwing haymaker after haymaker, breaking chairs over people, but you never had a sense that any of the characters were ever hurt by any of this. They just kind of got up and dusted themselves and went on their way. And then, of course, Jack Palance's character as a menace, and the gunfight in the mud, and that was really showing that death is not pretty. Sam Peckinpah did not like the way that the TV Westerns of the 1950s portrayed violence. You could watch something like Gunsmoke, and Matt Dillon would shoot somebody at the end, and he might pause for a moment of reflection. Then he'd turn to Chester and say, well, you ready to go get some dinner? And things just went on their way. If you look at Shane, that violence had reverberations with people. It stuck with them. Peckinpah spent a lot of time on his grandfather's ranch outside Fresno, California. And he saw a lot of these old timers when he was sort of an innocent blonde-haired kid like the kid in Shane. That spoke to him too, this whole thing of how a kid sees these important adult matters, and sometimes really terrible matters, and how he processes it, how that might affect him later in life. And so I think Peckinpah certainly had that connection with, a kid's view of violence. You see that again and again. Matthew Peckinpah, Sam's son, is in the opening shootout of The Wild Bunch. And one of the really startling scenes, you see Matthew Peckinpah, who's much like the kid in Shane in appearance. He's got his arms around a girl, and while all of this violence is going on. So here you have this innocence caught in this horror. What does this do to children? What does this do to them, and how they'll live out their lives?
Yeah, I remember that shot of the boy and the girl holding each other amidst the gunplay. I did not know that was his son. That's interesting. So let's talk about the Western genre in the 1960s. That's a decade when John Ford's career came to an end, Howard Hawks as well, and you had the emergence of new perspectives. The revisionist Western with Sergio Leone, the existential Western with Monty Hellman. Talk about where this genre was around the time that The Wild Bunch kicked into life in 1967-68.
It was in trouble. The Western had been reliable for Hollywood, both the Poverty Row studios all the way up through Paramount and MGM. when television really fired up in the 1950s, there were many, many TV shows that were Western based as well. So by the time you get to the 60s, and Ford, his real farewell film, in my opinion, is The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. The TV shows had run their course and were, struggling to stay above water on networks. So something new had to happen. And so the whole revisionist Western thing came in. Peckinpah, he did this amazing movie in 1962 called Ride the High Country. It was a traditional Western on the one hand, but it was also very revisionist in another. It had Joel McCrea and Randolph Scott as the stars. Everybody who saw those guys immediately thought Westerns because they'd made so many of them. But it was, very this elegiac kind of thing going on with that picture. And you also had, at the same time, this introduction of this revisionist kind of thing in the form of particularly the Hammond brothers, Warren Oates in particular. This was a menacing bunch of people, the likes of which we really hadn't seen in Westerns before. These are brothers who are in the California gold fields. We don't really know where they came from, but we do know that one of the practices they had back home was when one of them got married, all of the brothers got to share the bride. And going places you just didn't go in 1962 with films, and Peckinpah was doing that with Ride the High Country, and which was produced by MGM as a throwaway, basically. They wanted to get that film in Europe because they knew they could make some money from interest in cowboy pictures there. A very low-budget film. But it turned out to be an amazing picture that won a ranking at Cannes, won a gold medal in Belgium. Other major festivals recognized what Peckinpah had done with this. Within a couple of years in Italy, Sergio Leone started doing The Man with No Name pictures, and that would be A Fistful of Dollars for a Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It did two things. First, it took the Western into these places where, just wasn't supposed to go before. It was very dirty, for one thing. You had a lot of mud and blood and stuff that you typically didn't see in a dressed-up Hollywood production. It involved topics that were not usually explored in Westerns. And you had this Eastwood character who was really pretty much an existentialist. So it was artistically very well done. Leone had an amazing filmmaker's eye. I watch those things and I'm just amazed at the shots. And he did all of this on very low budgets by American standards. The first film started to get traction in Italy and then took off. Then there was demand for it in the rest of Europe. Then suddenly United Artists said, we want to buy this. We're going to dub it in English and we're going to release it in the U.S. Well, it becomes a big hit. And then The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly just was a tremendous success worldwide. This got, the money people to thinking about what is the market possibilities for, a Western that's of this kind of Leone vision. And so that helped make the financing for pictures like The Wild Bunch something that Hollywood would even consider.
Now, after Ride the High Country, Peckinpah's next directing job was Major Dundee, released in 1965, a critical and commercial flop, starring Charlton Heston, and that threw what was shaping up to be a promising career for Peckinpah badly off track and sort of set the stage for his ongoing hassles with what he called the suits, so the producers. Now, some of those difficulties in later years were probably his fault. He was no angel, certainly, but some were not. And similar to Orson Welles, many of Peckinpah's films were taken out of his hands in post-production and just butchered. But what went wrong on Major Dundee, and where did that leave Peckinpah professionally in 1966?
The backstory to that is Columbia, the studio that produced Major Dundee, was teetering on bankruptcy. And so this project had started as being this major kind of spectacle picture and go into David Lean territory in terms of size. Ride the High Country, for all of those magnificent footage that Lucien Ballard shot of mountains and forest and all that, it was really a small film. It wasn't like Lawrence of Arabia or anything like that. Well, this was Peckinpah's chance to move into that territory. Well, after things got rolling, Columbia backtracked and decided this was just going to be another Western they were going to release. So they started trying to cut corners. Well, Peckinpah didn't want to give up his vision of this, and he began to fight with Columbia, and it ended up being so nasty a battle that the studio head at the time actually burned lots of the negatives so that Peckinpah's cut that he did, no one would ever see it. It was just that kind of hatred that grew out of it. In fairness, you also had Sam Peckinpah, who'd come up in television, but he was still a director trying to find his way. And he had not had any experience with doing things at the scope that Major Dundee required. So one of the things he did is he decided on locations in Mexico that were hundreds of miles apart. So you had this huge expense of moving a movie company that had dozens and dozens of people involved with it. So it was very expensive doing that. He fell behind schedule. He went into the production with a screenplay that still needed work, and he had it in mind that he could fix that as he was making the movie. Well, that didn't work out so well. And it ended up being a disaster. And Peckinpah, who had been considered this kind of wonder kid who had done Ride the High Country, suddenly word started to spread. And exacerbating all of this is Peckinpah's own personal demons. He was a man who, throughout his life, had issues with paranoia. Certainly, he was in situations where he had reason not to trust people, but he also took it to another level of just kind of being paranoid when there was nothing to be paranoid about. And then, of course, he was an alcoholic. Even by the time he was in high school, he was drinking at a level that would be of concern. Certainly, his experiences at the end of World War II and afterwards as a Marine stationed in China and so forth. He was very much into this drinking culture. So the reputation spread that he was a drunk and he couldn't be relied on. Then he was hired to do the Cincinnati Kid, and he was on the picture for 1 week and then was fired as director because of just differences with the producer about what the vision of the picture was going to be. And Cincinnati Kid's a film that I enjoy watching, but at the end, it's a Hollywood movie with a big star, Steve McQueen, and it's not the art film that Sam Peckinpah wanted to make about the Depression in America in the 1930s and labor strikes and all these things he was thinking about including. So those two experiences really got him hammered. He was deemed by the studios to be unreliable as a director. Now, Sam Peckinpah was a very good screenwriter, at his best taking a property that had been developed somewhat by someone else and then doing the fine work on it. He was a master at writing dialogue. One of the people who really influenced him was the playwright Tennessee Williams. So he was able to pay his bills by working on scripts, but no one would hire him as a director for a couple of years there until he was given this chance to direct Noon Wine based on the Catherine Ann Porter short novel for what essentially we would come to call a TV movie. That allowed him to get a kind of a fingernail grip back into the business as a director. And that directly led to his being able to do The Wild Bunch.
And, although he directed a number of other very good films, The Wild Bunch is certainly Peckinpah's crowning achievement. But as you make it clear in the book, it's the achievement of more than just one person. And so to me, if there's ever a film that stands as a rebuttal of the auteur theory, this idea that a film has just one author, which I always found kind of absurd. I mean, especially in Hollywood, this is it. It's very much a collaborative effort from pre-production to post. And in fact, the original story was conceived not by Peckinpah, but by someone else. Give us a little background, if you would, on the origin and the evolution of this screenplay.
Well, I first have to ask a question. Am I allowed to use profanity here?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Peckinpah, his direct quote was, "The auteur theory is shit."
Agreed.
So we can have that down. The Wild Bunch had its beginnings with one of the best stuntmen in Hollywood in the 1950s and 60s, a guy named Roy Sickner. Was a stuntman, but also had become kind of a stunt coordinator, stunt gaffer, was kind of moving his career upwards. And while he was working on a picture, he got this notion about a movie that would involve some guys who were experienced Old West bank robbers sticking up a bank and then fleeing to Mexico, having some adventures there that ends up with a kind of massive shooting at the end. He wasn't a writer, but he had this idea and he thought this would go. There was room for this kind of picture in Hollywood. So he talked to his friend Lee Marvin about it, and Lee Marvin's career was just taking off like the proverbial rocket. And Sickner got Marvin engaged with this, and Marvin agreed to act in it. Well, there you have it. You have a star who's agreed to be part of a project. At that point, he tries selling this, and he's not very successful at it, mostly because he doesn't have a treatment, let alone a screenplay. He's able to hire a young TV writer named Waylon Green, who had been doing things like Jacques Cousteau specials and that kind of thing for television. He'd never written a script for a full-blown feature film before, and so he was available to work cheap. Waylon Green had gone to college in Mexico, had worked in the country, completely fluent in Spanish. And as part of a job he had there, he started meeting these old men who had fought in the Mexican Revolution. And Green was storing this away, in the gray matter. And the first thing he does is he convinces Sickner that it'd be a whole lot more interesting if this movie were set during the Mexican Revolution. Green then gave us the Wild Bunch story. Peckinpah would eventually get a screenwriting credit for himself for the rewrites he did. He went to his grave saying, Waylon Green gave me the story. He gave me the characters. So from there, we have this script. And knowing that it needs more work, and knowing that Sam Peckinpah was at a point where he was taking in script work because that's how he was paying the bills, Sickner approached him about it. And Sam read it, and then he saw things in this picture that no one else saw that plugged into some of the big themes of his best work: the horrible effects of violence on people, the tyranny of technology as it moved into the 20th century. Sam Peckinpah hated the 20th century. The notion of what happens when loyalty between men is betrayed and how does that play out over the years. So Peckinpah took the script of Waylon Green's and then started rewriting, remembering well the lesson of Major Dundee, that you don't go into a picture with a script half written. And it was something he invested his heart in, never dreaming that circumstances would develop that would allow him to actually direct it.
Now, screenwriter aside, arguably the three most important creative forces behind the camera were, first of all, Peckinpah, Lou Lombardo, whose editing played such a huge role in giving this film its unique look, and the very underappreciated composer Jerry Fielding. Now, these were three very different men, but they all had one thing in common: they cut their teeth in the world of television. Give us a sense of how that experience in the world of TV production shaped them and provided tools which they used on The Wild Bunch.
Television was a medium that was inventing itself as it went along. And by the time The Wild Bunch was filmed, Hollywood, had these very set standards. This is how we do this. If you shoot a Western, this is how many rounds of ammunition you need to budget for, on and on and on. Television was, this free-flowing thing that had tons of brilliant people working in it when they were young, Peckinpah, but also Robert Altman. You go down the line. There's just so many. So they looked at what they were doing in an unschooled way. Lou Lombardo who Robert Altman found in Kansas City and got him to California. Lou Lombardo, had he gone the traditional route, would have spent years working his way through the union system to become a film editor. He was thrown into television, and he said, "You have to have this ready to air in the next few days, or else our sponsors are going to pull out. We won't make any money." So there's a lot of pressure there. And that was true, too. I mean, Peckinpah, his television reputation was he worked fast and turned out quality work. He never missed a deadline, which is very different from what happened when he started working in feature films. Jerry Fielding came into the business in a group of musicians that came out of Pittsburgh that included like Henry Mancini, very talented group. He came up through nightclub routes and got into television himself. There was reluctance to using him on the Wild Bunch because of the old prejudices that were still in play, like at Warner Brothers at the time. The brass said, well, no, we can't use him because he's a TV music guy. He doesn't do, feature films. Well, it's good that none of these people were feature film guys, because they brought in these great notions about how to do things. This picture, which plays at a little over 2 hours, it has more than 80 minutes of music in it. The music is so important for this picture. Fielding wrote this ingenious score very quickly, but he made a trip to Mexico. He listened to songs that were played during the Revolution. You hear these little, maybe 8 bars here, 12 bars there of Mexican music that he's incorporated seamlessly into this larger score. It was just so well done. On the other hand, you had somebody like Lucien Ballard, who was the cinematographer, pure feature film guy. He came up through the Hollywood system. He was responsible for, I guess, maybe half a dozen Peckinpah films, starting with Ride to High Country. But even Ballard was sort of an outlaw within the system, and working with Peckinpah gave him the chance to really come full flower to what he could do. Ballard was known as the master of black and white photography, but then suddenly in the 50s, he started working with Bud Boetticher and other directors, turning out this magnificent color work. And one of the things Peckinpah wanted was this to have sort of a sepia feel to look to it, sort of like an aged newsreel. And so Ballard knew that you could flash expose color negative film just ever so briefly to give it that kind of look. There was no computers around then that could do this sort of thing. It was just old tricks of the trade. So he gave the Wild Bunch this distinctive look. And then you had Lou Lombardo taking this footage that Ballard was shooting and editing it in ways that no one had ever edited before.
Well, something I learned from your book that I did not know, if you think of the visual signature of the Wild Bunch, you think of a technique that Peckinpah used in many later films as well, and it's this slow motion cutting during the violent sequences. In other words, you see somebody shot on top of a building, they start to fall in slow motion. He cuts away to regular speed action. He cuts back, and that shot person is in mid-flight, falling to the ground in slow motion. He cuts away again, then cuts back, and that person is crashing into the ground. It's a kind of beautiful slowing of the tempo, and it's Lombardo, the editor, that came up with that, right?
Correct. He'd done a little bit of this with some of his TV work, but this gave him the opportunity to, really go full force, and that he was the visionary on that kind of thing. And it was, help me out here, who directed The Hurt Locker?
Yeah, it's a female director, and I can't think of her name.
And she saw the Wild Bunch, and it was Lombardo's editing that really made her want to become a director. She called it Gestalt editing. And again, you had Ballard, who would be running maybe 6 cameras simultaneously, all of them running at different speeds. That gave Lombardo and Bob Wolf, who was also a very important editor on this, the opportunity to do these things with film running at different speeds. So yeah, it's the ballet of death that you see. It takes you a place that film had never gone before. And Peckinpah said that when he was in China immediately after World War II, when the forces of Chiang Kai-shek were fighting the forces of Mao Zedong, he came under fire one time on a train. Some people were shot, bullets whizzing around and all of that. And he fell to the floor like every reasonable person would until it was over. When he got up, he thought, God, that lasted forever. And he looked at his watch and it was less than 5 minutes, And so he had this notion from that point on that when you're in that situation of being fired at and your life is really in danger, everything slows down and you have this stuff going at slow motion. And I agree with him. That slow motion in the Wild Bunch really captured what it's like to be in a shootout and what how you emotionally will react to it. One of the things he had going here, for the one time in his career, he had complete, total backing by a major studio, Warner Brothers, which had been taken over by the Seven Arts Corporation, and a young production manager wanted Peckinpah in the fold and gave him the chance to direct again. Warner Brothers resources were open to him, and he had support at the very top of the studio. Even when his producer was in disagreement with him, he was frequently overruled by the brass. So Sam, for once, had everything he wanted, hundreds of horses and hundreds of extras. And he did this picture that really is like a David Lean film in many places. It's very big and very impressive, plus these amazing smaller scenes as well. So it was the one time in his life where everything clicked for him.
Now, as far as the actors, there's too many important roles to get into all of them. So let's focus on the lead role, Pike Bishop. As you mentioned, Lee Marvin was originally going to play that part, and he actually made some story suggestions that stayed in the film, but finally that part went to William Holden, who was going through some turmoil in his life. How did the producers and Peckinpah get from Lee Marvin to William Holden for that crucial lead role?
Lee Marvin won an Oscar for Cat Ballou. He also did a picture called The Professionals, which I think is a very good film, but it's set during the Mexican Revolution, and it's has a character that in some ways is sort of like Pike Bishop, the main character in the Wild Bunch. So Marvin was sort of starting to think, well, I don't know if I want to be typecast in this way. I want to explore other things I can do. And about this time, his power agent in Hollywood got him $1 million contract to appear in Paint Your Wagon alongside Clint Eastwood, who also got $1 million. By today's standards, you kind of shrug your shoulders, I guess, at $1 million. But if you had $1 million in the late 1960s, you were set for life. And so Marvin, when the $1 million came along, he took it and bowed out of the Wild Bunch. And you're not going to find many greater Lee Marvin fans than me. I think Marvin's great, but I'm so glad he bowed out of this picture because they ultimately settled on William Holden. Now, you go back to the mid-1950s, Holden was as big as you could find in Hollywood in terms of box office. He brought people into movies. He was incredibly good looking, had this wonderful presence on screen. He was a movie star who, when challenged, had serious acting chops. He was a very, very good actor. Unfortunately, he didn't have that many films he could really, exhibit that in. But those that he did, he was, we think of the Billy Wilder films, of course, and then the Bridge Over the River Kwai, things like that. He was really a terrific actor. He had made a lot of bad choices about film roles to take through the 1960s. He was getting older. He was, like Sam Peckinpah, an alcoholic, and his alcoholism had really hurt his physical appearance and had actually caused him to be involved in a traffic accident in Italy in which he killed a man. By the time he came on board for the Wild Bunch, he was still had this suspended sentence kind of hanging over him. He was sort of on a probation thing. He'd really just made a mess out of his life and out of his career. And so he came into the Wild Bunch because he needed a job. But as he started working with Peckinpah and started seeing what Peckinpah was going to do with this picture, he realized that this was a chance to make some art. And in this character of Pike Bishop, who's a gunfighter who is at the end of his run of being able to do that kind of thing, and he's made serious mistakes. He's caused people to be killed. His best friend, he chickened out of a situation, allowed his best friend to be captured and sent off to prison. He's really a compromised man, and Holden obviously just saw much of himself in this character of Pike Bishop.
So the plot of the film, which takes place around 1913, deals with a gang of outlaws. They're after that mythical one last score. Although it should be said, one of their members, Angel, the only Mexican, has loftier motivations than just money. He wants to support his people's struggle against federal forces led by the corrupt General Mapache. Now, a central theme, as you say in your book, is this idea of men out of step with their time. Men with a specific code, which sometimes they observe, sometimes they don't, who are sort of being hemmed in on all sides. So Kip, how would you characterize that code? What are these guys for? What are they against? And what is it specifically about their time, the era just before World War I, that they oppose?
There's an old saying in cowboy country, when a man is evaluating another man, he'll say, he's somebody you'd want to ride the river with. And you think, well, what the hell does that mean? Well, you think if you're rounding up cattle or you're along a river, there's quicksand, there's all kinds of treachery. And if you really trust somebody, he's somebody you'd want to ride the river with. You count on him to help you out. And I think these guys all adhere to that in one form or another. They're awfully bad people. As Peckinpah's great friend and collaborator Jim Silk said, these are bad men, but we care about them so, and we do end up caring about them. But it's one of the struggles they have is with this code. And are you going to be a human being, or are you going to be like some animal, as Holden says in an important sequence? The Pike Bishop character has really failed at riding the river with his best friend Deke Thornton, who's played by Robert Ryan. He abandoned him to arrest and prison, and saved his own skin, and is haunted by doing that. And now he's haunted in real life because the railroad has made a deal with Deke Thornton. He can get out of prison if he'll help them track down this train robber that annoys them and make sure that he comes back dead. So now he's got a very real haunting going on as well by bounty hunters after him, led by his former best friend. His former best friend, of course, in Deke Thornton, is tremendously conflicted about going after his old buddy. So you have this whole thing about trust. When everything else falls away, that's what we have is who can you trust? Who can you ride the river with? Because that kind of ethos is under full-blown attack in the early 20th century and remains so to this day. And then the destructive nature of what happened with the technology of weaponry. Suddenly you have a machine gun introduced among these guys and hand grenades among these guys who were roughly in their 50s, maybe about to turn 50, who'd known a time when you couldn't take out that many with just pulling a trigger and kill, as we see in the final shootout, hundreds of people, or I think there's more, around 120 Mexicans end up dead. They started filming roughly at the time Martin Luther King was assassinated. They concluded filming about the time that Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And all sorts of things were going on in the world. The Russians rolled into Prague, the student riots in Paris, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. All of these things in 1968 were going on while this film was being made. Plus Vietnam, where you had napalm and Agent Orange and these tremendous killing machines that had developed through advances in technology. And so this is a huge concern of Peckinpah's in this movie. And how did these men respond? Well, in the end, when their friend Angel is being tortured and is on his way to death, knowing what awaits them, they take these steps to try to do the right thing for one time. And, the steps are so brilliantly choreographed in the walk sequence of those four guys walking to their doom. They know they're going to be killed, but they're going to at least try to do something right, something that's human. This is an ultimate expression of humanism at the end of this film, and knowing what they're going to get for it. But at least they try.
That's right.
And they've never done that before, you know. And it is interesting that Robert Ryan's character, he doesn't have to shoot his old buddy. You know, it happens apart from him. And so he lets his low-life bounty hunter colleagues go back to Texas by themselves, and he stays in Mexico. And what does he do? Well, he joins up with the villagers who are aligned with Pancho Villa. He becomes part of the revolution. So he does something meaningful at the end, too. In this weird way, this picture becomes very affirming in those last 5 minutes.
You know, what makes Peckinpah's films stand out for me, even the lesser ones, is this incredible honesty about human beings. He has an almost maniacal determination to show the darker side of our species, to explode any idealistic romantic notions about Homo sapiens. Not just men, but women and children too. Almost no one in the Wild Bunch is presented as wholly good or pure. There are the bad and the less bad. And I think, the least bad people as presented are the residents of that Mexican village where Angel grew up. But even there, we learn that Angel's girlfriend has deserted him to go off with Mapache, and they make the point that she was happy to do it. And later we discover that Angel's own mother has betrayed him to Mapache, leading to his torture. So Peckinpah pulls no punches in his depiction of human corruption, including children. One of the first things we see during the opening credits is a group of children smiling and laughing, and then it's revealed that they're torturing a scorpion. They've placed a scorpion on a pile of red ants, and they ultimately set that whole pile on fire. It's striking, it's disturbing, it's a brilliant metaphor for what's to come, and it's also an example of Peckinpah's willingness to take good ideas from any corner. So Kip, talk about that opening title sequence, one of the most brilliant ever in my opinion, how it was put together, and how it sets up the rest of the film.
I think it's worth mentioning here that one of the big influences on Sam Peckinpah was the writing of Robert Audrey and the territorial imperative and that sort of thing. So he thought a lot about Homo sapiens, and what we're capable of, and that Audrey always comes back to it. We're really killer apes. Whatever else we move into, we've got that part of us in our core, and to emphasize that even the innocent, the young children, have some of that that's just part of them. It's not learned behavior, it's somehow part of them. And you show that with kids dropping the scorpions onto an ant den, and there's a little corral made of sticks to keep the scorpions from escaping, and so they're fighting. But the scorpions are going to die because they're bigger than an ant, but you got millions of ants and only a couple of scorpions, and so eventually they're going to go. And there's some truth in life about that. But then of course the kids destroy the scorpions and ants altogether with fire, and for some of us, some of that is a little disturbing and reminding us of some of the things we did when we were kids, like me and red ants and grasshoppers and firecrackers, and I watched that in the Wild Bunch, and I think back some of the stuff I did when I was 10. But that's the point. It's this thing that's in us we can't escape. And you're absolutely right. This is not in the shooting script that Sam Peckinpah took to Coahuila with him. He got down there, and the great Mexican director, Emilio Fernandez, who was acting in the picture and played the part of Mapache, was watching the opening shootout sequences. And he said to Sam, you know what this reminds me of? It's when I was a kid and we used to drop scorpions into red ant dens. And Peckinpah says, what? And then suddenly he improvised based on this suggestion. And that became, again, one of those parts of the Wild Bunch no one ever forgets. He almost has kids that look like cherubs almost, the big cheeks and such sweet kids doing these terrible things with ants and scorpions. But yeah, you're absolutely right about Peckinpah, and he was open for suggestions. One thing that I discovered, and I don't know that anyone will ever know exactly how this happened, but there are two key sequences involving Edmund O'Brien's character of Old Man Sykes. One is after the failed robbery occurs and the bunch retreats to Mexico with more than half of their number killed, and just these five guys surviving at that point. And he's asking, what happened to the other guys? We don't need them. But he has this little monologue kind of thing about who is they. And it's really significant in terms of the way the story develops. Well, again, it wasn't in the shooting script. I saw the script of O'Brien's that his son now has, and in Edmund O'Brien's hand with using a green ink pen, he wrote all of those lines down on the back of a blank page in the script, as he did the final lines of the movie. He has the last line, which is, "It ain't like it used to be, but it'll do." Well, again, that's not in the shooting script. That's written in Edmund O'Brien's hand in green ink on his copy of the script. Whether that came out of an idea that Peckinpah had during rehearsals before shooting, or if that's something that O'Brien came up with and suggested to Peckinpah. If O'Brien came up with a line like, "It ain't like it used to be, but it'll do," I know Sam Peckinpah would say, "Yeah, that's better than what we got. Let's go with that." He was willing to turn loose of his ego in order to get the best stuff on film.
And one of my favorite aspects of Peckinpah is his ability to convey meaning without words, to employ pure cinema. There's a scene early in the film of Holden, who's injured, and he's having difficulty mounting his horse as he's being ridiculed by a couple of members of the bunch. And after he finally does, the camera stays on him from the rear, and just his slumped posture on that horse as he literally goes over the hill, it says so much about where this man is in life. And then there's that terrific train robbery with almost no dialogue and no music, which is a great decision. And then that scene at the end that you mentioned, that legendary walk, as they decide to go rescue Angel from the clutches of Mapache. Talk about some of the wordless sequences in this film, especially that walk at the end, and how that came about, because that was interesting.
Well, let's go just a little before the walk, inside the whorehouse.
Right.
With Holden, Ben Johnson, and Warren Oates. And after, spending the night with the woman in the whorehouse, Holden gets up and he's self-loathing, the call of responsibility, all sorts of things are shown in this without words as he's dealing with this woman, just by his face and his body language. Then he, sticks his head through the door into the room where the Gorch brothers are. And he says two words, "Let's go." And, Warren Oates looks at him, then looks over at his brother, then looks back at Holden and says, "Why not?" And, those four words, I think today you say, well, people aren't going to understand what that means, and you need to have a monologue saying, well, I've reached this point in my life where I can't go. But no, Peckinpah knew that, and you look at that face of William Holden, that close-up shot. My God, that's a work of art in itself. Like all of humanity is in that face for that moment. And then the walk. Cliff Coleman, the first AD, who again is one of those people who was so important to this film being the success it was, he was able to implement a lot of these visions that Peckinpah had. And Cliff was ready to break things down and go to the encounter with Mapache. And Sam said, "No, wait a minute, Cliff. I want to do a walk thing." And it was not in the script, no thought about it at all. They did have, Peckinpah had been saving a telephoto lens to shoot it. And so that was improvised. And it was the brilliance of Cliff Coleman as to finding people and filling this whole thing in and getting the kind of stuff that Peckinpah wanted. And Peckinpah was one of those guys who couldn't always articulate what he wanted in a way that people would understand, except this kind of core group of people he worked with frequently, like Cliff Coleman or Gordon Dawson or some others. They got from what he might mumble what he really wanted. So Coleman, my Lord, if you look at that walk sequence, how populated it is with different things going on. So Peckinpah very much understood. This comes down to all of cinema, in my opinion. It still comes down to telling a story with the lens of a camera. And then the other things you add to it are, in addition, enhancers of what you're doing. But Peckinpah had a good sense of how things should look visually. And a lot of that is, goes back to his mother, who had artistic leanings. Both as a painter and as a gardener, a woman with whom he had a very, very difficult and complicated relationship. But he did, and to the end, he always credited her with giving him that sense of visual art. And one of the kind of the tragic things about Sam Peckinpah is that you realize just how good he was and what he accomplished in, maybe 12 films. And you think about what he might have been able to have accomplished had the industry not been changing the way it did, if that hadn't happened, and if Peckinpah had not had his alcoholism and had he not had these other demons he has, you just had this kind of tragic sense of what could have been.
Yeah, I kind of got the sense reading your book that Peckinpah was at or near the top of his game during this shoot in early '68. He didn't drink to excess as he did on later shoots or use drugs. And, there's a great story that you relate that to me highlights the positive elements of Peckinpah's directing and his leadership, which sometimes gets obscured by the more controversial or salacious aspects of his legend, where on one of Holden's days off, Peckinpah invited him to observe a day of filming. It's a scene with Strother Martin and L.Q. Jones. Talk about what Holden observed that day, and just generally how Peckinpah pushed and inspired not just his cast, but really everyone on this project, including stuntmen, to go above and beyond the call of duty.
Oh yeah, it's a sequence that occurs after the opening shootout, and these low-life bounty hunters are again taking us to characters we've never seen before in American pictures or maybe anywhere else. These reprehensible characters played by Strother Martin, who for my money, this is Strother Martin's greatest role, and L.Q. Jones, who's such a fine and character actor and has been for so many years, and is still alive and well in Hollywood now at age 92. But this is the thing about, Giddy's boots. Oh, this one's got gold in his teeth. What's got the,
They're parasites.
Yeah, parasites, exactly. And so Sam's having him redo this and stuff, and Holden's watching. And then he gets up and starts to leave. And Peckinpah, brings things to stop. And he says, Bill, where are you going? And Holden says, are you going to shoot the rest of this picture this way? And Peckinpah says, well, yeah. And Holden says, I need to go study my lines, because he'd been walking through some pictures for the previous few years, but he suddenly got a sense of what Peckinpah was doing, where he was going to take this in terms of filmmaking. And Holden says, okay, I need to go do some work and get ready for this. And thank God he did.
And like so many landmark films released in the late 60s, Bonnie and Clyde, for example, and Kubrick's 2001, critical reaction to The Wild Bunch was very intense and very mixed. And another similarity to those earlier two films, a number of critics, including Pauline Kael, would revise their views on The Wild Bunch as time went on, generally revise their views upward. But talk about the audience and critical reaction to The Wild Bunch when it was released in 1969.
And at that time, studios had junkets for critics. They would provide these trips and hotel stays and lots of good food and lots of good booze. Warner Brothers did this for its films and had all of these critics in the Caribbean to see The Wild Bunch. And even before it was shown, just the word of mouth had some of them already sharpening their knives. And at the press conference that followed, the woman from Reader's Digest demanded to know why this movie was even filmed. she was indignant. And another person who was absolutely indignant about the film was Rex Reed. The woman from Reader's Digest represented, kind of the Richard Nixon's silent majority sort of point of view of things. But Rex Reed was a younger writer, and he didn't get it. And there was a young guy from Chicago at the beginning of his career who stood up and said, and called bullshit on this. He said, this is a masterpiece we've just seen. You know, you people are crazy. And of course, the young guy from Chicago was Roger Ebert. So you had kind of a split there. A lot of the traditionalists just hated it and could not turn loose of the violence in it. But for the most part, younger critics got it. And people who had really paid attention to films, and they were not just newspaper critics, but had actually, you got to understand, putting things in perspective, people who reviewed movies in the late 60s for newspapers often weren't very knowledgeable about film as art. They just looked at it for entertainment value. And, people like Ebert represented, sort of this younger generation who, the film studies boom was going on in American colleges and universities. And so you had these younger people of the baby boom generation at the time who were really tuned in, who had seen Truffaut's 400 Blows, understood what Fellini had accomplished. They brought that with them when they went to see something like The Wild Bunch, and they said, yes, this is art. But there were voices of outrage at the way the violence was portrayed in it.
Well, the irony of that Reader's Digest critic's complaint is the film is arguably taking a stand against violence. I mean, how do you make a film about violence without showing violence?
Well, and of course, Peckinpah said he was trying to instill a sense of catharsis in the people who saw this movie, who would go out and then examine their world and say, what are we doing in Vietnam? He was really appalled by all of that, and he was thinking, maybe people can see this and go out and say, we don't need to do this anymore. And of course, then Peckinpah had an interview with the BBC in the mid-70s, and he explained all of this, and then he said, I failed.
Well, I personally don't think he failed. I think maybe society failed.
I tend to agree with you. I don't think he failed at all. I have a friend who's a woman who's a therapist, a psychological therapist, and she saw the film for the first time. She was in her 50s, I guess, when she saw it, and it made her think, about violence. And that still happens with this movie. So I agree. I think society's the one that failed. This picture has made its point quite eloquently, and it's lasted for 50 years, that eloquence.
All right, final question, Kip, and you've been really generous with your time, which we appreciate. As you researched and wrote this book, what surprised you the most about what you discovered?
It should have been obvious to me going into this, but that is the enormous contribution made to this movie by Mexican and Mexican-American filmmakers. When I say filmmakers, I mean both actors and crew members. Every one of those roles is filled by a Latino actor. Mexican or Mexican-Americans, except one, Jaime Sanchez, who played Angel, who was Puerto Rican, but who grew up on Mexican movies in Ponce, Puerto Rico. If you put this into context of American films of that time, I mentioned The Professionals earlier. You had Jack Palance playing a Mexican in that, and this odd casting.
Yul Brynner.
Yul Brynner, exactly. My friend Manny Martinez, who's from San Antonio originally and is a novelist, he told me over dinner one time, he said, I love The Wild Bunch. He said, when I saw it as a kid, I thought, wow, I've never seen so many Mexicans in a movie before. The movie has more than 3,000 cuts in it. Some of that is so fast, little shots of people. And Peckinpah did these close-ups of people he hired as extras who lived in the villages around Parras, where most of the film was shot. And part of the texture of this is so many faces that just leads us to this humanity.
Yeah, and it really gives the film an incredible authenticity. The book is called The Wild Bunch, Sam Peckinpah, A Revolution in Hollywood, and the Making of a Legendary Film. Pick it up. It's an amazing behind-the-scenes look with tons of anecdotes, twists and turns that we didn't even get into today, with some remarkable location photographs as well. Kip, incredible work here. Thank you so much for being part of the show. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for the kind words, and thank you for this opportunity. As is obvious, once I get started on Peckinpah, I can talk for a long time.
Oh, I could talk for a lot longer as well. All right, we'll come back. More Gotham Variety in just a moment.
Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Gotham Variety, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, joe@gothamvariety.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and get exclusive access to bonus content, please go to patreon.com/GothamVariety and subscribe.
And that'll do it for this week's episode of Gotham Variety. Don't forget to check us out and subscribe on Apple, Stitcher, or Spotify so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.